jump into the study. This speed that we're kind of going at will be the speed through many of the books that we're going into now as we're looking to tackle these books in just one or two sessions together. So they will be jam-packed, but today we have less chapters and less information to cover, but still just a dearth of things to look at. So we're going to jump in at chapter 16, and the reason that we went beyond the midpoint of Leviticus is because if we stopped anywhere before this, then we kind of would have been in this weird section of leprosy and laws about discharge, and it just was not a good place to stop and then pick up with this one and then try to go into the feast. So what we tried to do is get to a good stopping point where we could have a clean stop and a clean start, which is what we have with today. So in chapter 16, we are going to jump in and start talking about the Day of Atonement. This section begins what's going to be the feast section of Leviticus. He's going to still give some laws as we go through it because there's certain details and items that will pop up as we're going along, but he's going to switch gears just a little bit. We went through the sacrifices. We went through the laws about certain health issues that need to be addressed, but now he's looking at these national days of feasts and observances that will come across Israel. Chapter 16 has this first one that he gives us. Right, the Day of Atonement. We're told in verse 1 that these instructions come after the death of Nadab and Abihu. Therefore, this comes after God's warning to Aaron that I will be treated as holy. Before all people, I will be honored. That becomes the starting point for this. What we'll see as we go through the book of Leviticus, and even when we go into the book of Numbers, that being part of the Aaronic priesthood is not a vacation. It doesn't mean that you work one day a year. Instead, all the pressure and all the responsibility for the religious system that Israel's going to walk into will rest upon their shoulders. And it starts with this first feast as he goes to them, and he's telling them, listen, this is what you're going to do, and if it's not done in exactly this manner, I'm going to hold you responsible for it. I'm not going to hold the people responsible for it. The priesthood will be held responsible for it. And what follows at the very beginning of it is how the instructions for how Aaron must approach God. Now, we're going to be told at the end of the chapter this is to happen one day a year. This particular event was a one day a year. And in another chapter, we'll see that it has to happen exactly on this particular day. Not one day before, not one day after. If it doesn't happen exactly on this day, because of the purpose of this particular feast, it means that Israel will have to go an entire calendar year again without having their sins removed from them. But it starts here with the personal preparation of the high priest's own body, that's verses 2 through 4. So everything begins with the high priest being clean, being able to be the conduit of grace for the rest of the nation. So the first thing he does is he's going to bathe himself and put on some holy garment. There are going to be animal sacrifices. We'll have an overview of them in verses 5 through 9. With verse 11 beginning the details of what's about to happen. But we're going to see there's going to be sin offerings for the priest. There's going to be goats for the sin offerings for the people. One for the sin offering, one for the scapegoat. There's going to be a ram for a burnt offering. And that's going to be part of what we see throughout the feast, but going throughout the sacrificial system. God is not just saving people from their sins. He's not just saving them from Egypt. He's saving them from something to deliver them to something. So not only are the sins going to be forgiven here, but there's also a burnt offering because they're being rededicated to God. It's not enough to just save you from your sins and leave you there. Instead, he saves you and he delivers you to something greater. We're told that the goats are going to be presented before the tabernacle, and a lot is going to be cast. And it's kind of sanctified dice. There's not a better way to put it. But some kind of lot is going to be cast. Whichever one that the lot indicates, whichever the two goats indicates, that one belongs to the Lord. That's the one that will be killed. The one that is the Lord's portion, that one will die. The other one will later be sent alive into the wilderness. First, though, the high priest has to do atonement for himself. So he's already cleaned himself physically. He's wearing the garments of the high priest. So this isn't something he comes in on his street clothes. You have to come in your office. It's all the responsibilities on you as high priest, not you, Aaron, you high priest. But once he does that, he comes and he brings the bull before it. He lays his hands on it. He kills the bull. But he doesn't do anything as far as the altar is concerned yet. Instead, what he does is he takes some of the blood of the bull and he goes into the tabernacle. He goes with a container with some of the bull's blood, but he also takes a fire pan full of coals. And he's going to take some of the handfuls of the incense that's going to be burned, and he goes all the way inside the Holy of Holies. Now, he only gets to do this one time a year. That means he goes into the holy place, that's the first room, goes past the veil, he goes into the second room in the back where the Ark of the Covenant is, and he's going to put blood before, blood on it, but he also puts this fire pan that's burning smoke and incense. It's almost like a cloud going on the inside. And when we get to Numbers, that makes a lot of sense to us, because when we see the presence of God coming down on the tabernacle, it comes as a cloud. And that cloud indicates his presence. It's what allows Aaron to step into that place at all. But the incense burning is a picture of the intercession, right? It's the idea of the prayers of the saints going up before God. We have this imagery in the Psalms as well. But the image here is very important. That fire pan of coals, the coals are coming from the burnt altar. That's where the sin offering is going to be laid, all those items. So they put in a shovel and they get a big handful of it, and they have this fire pan. Then they put some of the incense on it, and they go inside the room. Everything's being done by God, because what it is intercession for Aaron so he can go in and do intercession for the people. It starts with God doing everything. Aaron can't even go in on his own. He doesn't have the chops, the ability. He's not clean enough. God even has to intercede for Aaron so that Aaron can eventually intercede. When he goes in there, he's going to put some of the blood on his finger. He's going to sprinkle it on the east side of the mercy seat as well in front of the mercy seat. The image is very beautiful. We'll see this several times where blood's going to be put in front of something. And the image is that even the avenue to get to that thing for the intercession to start has to be sanctified with blood. With blood. God's really going to hammer it later on. It's by blood that atonement is made. That's why you're not allowed to eat it or drink it. But there's something else. We're told that he's going to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat 7 times. This may be speculation, but it is a beautiful image. Some Bible scholars have pointed out that when Jesus was on the cross, when his body was taken down, there would have been 7 large blood stains on top of the cross. 2 of them would have been from his feet, 2 of them from the hands where the nails were driven through. That's a total of 4. There's another one from the crown of thorns against this cross, so that's 5. Then there was one from his bloody back that had been flogged, that's 6. And then one from the spear that was driven in his side, that's 7. If that is accurate, it is an amazing picture of what it is that Jesus does on that cross. But now that atonement has been made for the high priest, that's just for him. Now he can go and start doing atonement. He can be the intercessor for the people. The goat for the sin offering, remember they had 2 goats. The lot was cast, whichever one it landed on, that one was going to be killed. The other one was going to become the scapegoat, but that one stays alive. The other one that's the sin offering is slaughtered. The body of the goat and the bull will eventually be taken and burned outside the camp. That's verse 27. We're not even there yet. We haven't put anything on the fire yet. But the blood for the goat is, again, brought inside and done the same thing as we saw with the bull for the sin offering. Why? Because there's nothing special about Aaron. The same blood and the same mechanism and the same demonstration and ritual that was used for him is used for the people, because he's not above them. He needs intercession just like they do. But this is done, verse 16, so that the high priest can make atonement for the impurities and transgressions for the people. Now, verse 17 is interesting, because it speaks to how well God knows us. He said, while this is going on, you're not allowed to do any other work inside the tabernacle, because he knows us. And we're going to try to multitask. So while Aaron is doing this very important ceremony, someone's going to go, oh, you know what? I really need to fill up the lights inside the tabernacle. I need to make sure that the bread is good. I need to make sure there's incense burning. He goes, no. When this is going on, the intention of the entire nation is upon it. Why? Because at the end of it, I'm going to take your sins away for the past year. Suddenly there will be no more guilt, no more heaviness, no more burden on your heart. Verses 18 through 19, we're told that there's atonement for the altar of incense as well. Now, this didn't happen for Aaron, and it doesn't happen for the people until after the blood of the goat is taken inside. But he's going to take some of this blood, and he's going to go to the altar of incense that's just inside the door to the left. He's going to first put some of the blood on the horns of it. What it speaks to is God's authority, by way of the blood, to intercede on behalf of the people. And then he sprinkles some of the blood on the altar in order to cleanse it, because the blood is making atonement for the people. It's that layer that's covering it and allowing God to forgive them of their sins. Verses 20 through 22, we're told details about the scapegoat. After atoning for the tabernacle and the altar of incense, the high priest was to bring the live goat before the tabernacle. He's going to lay his hands on the head of the live goat. He's going to confess the sins of the people over the goat. And then the high priest was to turn the live goat over to the hands of a man who stood in readiness. This is verse 21. It's a very strong verse in it. Because this man who stood in readiness would then lead the goat out into the wilderness. And that idea of readiness is very important because what it shows is this eagerness, this almost desperation on the part of the people. They go, we just want to be forgiven of our sins. We want to know that if we died right now and we stood before him, that we could stand there and walk into his presence. There's a need for it. He's not just laying there, you know what, I'll get around to it whenever I get around to it. As soon as Aaron goes, go, he grabs him and he goes. He takes him outside to the wilderness. And the idea is that because Aaron has confessed over this goat the sins of the people, this goat is going to bear those sins outside of the camp. Now, one goat has already died for their sins. But that's not enough because then the sins are still there. They've just been covered over with blood. He goes, no, we're getting rid of them. We're going to take them as far as the east is from the west. And that's Psalm 103, verse 12, that he takes our transgressions from us as far as the east is from the west. Now, verses 23 through 24 get really interesting. Now, the high priest is covered in blood. A couple of animals have been killed, and he's gone through this. So what he does is he's going to change clothes. But notice where he does it. He goes inside the tabernacle. He doesn't go back to his house and change. He goes inside the tabernacle and gets cleaned up. He puts on fresh clothes, and then he takes his soiled clothes, and they stay inside the tabernacle while he exits and offers the remaining offerings. Again, this may just be speculation, but perhaps this is a beautiful foretelling of the bloody grave clothes of Jesus lying in an empty tomb after the sacrifice was done, after the atonement was done, after our sins are taken away from us. Those bloody grave clothes stay there because he doesn't need them anymore. Because now he's going to take those who have been saved and redeemed, and he's going to rededicate them to God for a brand new life. And you don't need a bloody high priest for that. You need a clean high priest for that. Verses 24 through 28, we have the burnt offerings. Aaron is offering these burnt offerings for the rededication of Israel. Now he finally offers the fat from the sin offerings. The rest of the animals aren't burned, though, there. The ones for the animals, for the sin offerings, are not burned inside of the tabernacle and not inside the camp. So they offer those fat portions that are going to smell beautiful as they get burned, but the bodies for the bull and the goat is going to take taken outside of the camp. Where was Jesus crucified? Not inside Jerusalem, outside Jerusalem. That's where the body was consumed. They're not burned on the bronze altar. They're taken outside the camp. Then the man who leads the scapegoat out and the people who are burning the bull and the goat, because they're having these contact with, one's an unclean goat, as it were. The other ones are the dead bodies. I love this about what God does. As soon as they get done with their jobs, they come back. They have to clean up, change clothes, but they're allowed to come immediately back into the camp. They don't have to wait until evening. Now, you remember from last time, it was constantly, you do this, you're ceremonially unclean, get cleaned up, and then you come back in the evening time. The reason why, because that was the beginning of the next day, and his mercies are new each morning. So with the new morning, you get to come in, but not with this, because you were serving the body. And I love how considerate God is of the servants who serve the body. He doesn't make them wait. You don't have to stay lonely on the outside. Come back in, have fellowship. You did this service for all of us. 29 through 31, we're told the frequency. This is to happen once a year on the 10th day of the 7th month. We'll see later on the 7th month is very busy. We have 3 different feasts, all in just a couple of days, just a little bit over 2 weeks. We'll see all these feasts enacted together. But it was a day for the people to humble themselves, not do any work. It was a Sabbath of solemn rest. And the Day of Atonement was the day for the cleansing of the people. When we think about the other feasts, they're celebrations, and they absolutely are. The Day of Atonement, while it does, I guess you could say it technically is a feast, it is not a day of celebration. It's a day of remembering. It's that affliction of your heart, the confession of who you are, and the relief of knowing that God has taken all your sins away. Verses 32 through 34, we're told the responsibility is upon the high priest to see this done. Now, this is a lot of pressure on Aaron. Because when we go through Exodus and we go through Numbers, Aaron can't stop messing up. He's responsible for all the sins of the people being taken away. If he fails to do his job, they have to continue to live under guilt. This is so much. I mean, I can't speak for you, but I can't get my own life right from year to year. And yet he has this responsibility on him. Obviously, it's way too big for any person, and that's the point. It is always the point. Chapter 17. Now God starts talking about some of the rules regarding sacrifice. And some of these are pretty obvious, but they need to be said. One of them is, if you're doing an animal sacrifice to the Lord, you got to bring it to the tabernacle. You don't get to do it on your terms. You don't get to figure this out yourselves. You can't go, well, you know what? I don't feel like making the trip. I'm just going to offer it here. What's the big deal? You don't get to offer a sacrifice in your own special way. And boy, this really, really hits us in our current day and age, because how many of us know somebody will say, well, I don't go to organized church. I worship God in my own way. God goes, you don't get to, because that's part of surrender. You serve me on my terms. I'm not going to put on you something that you can't stand, something that you can't deal with, but this is part of it. It's part of being humble and coming to me. And it's shocking this even has to be mentioned, but verse 7 says, if you offer a sacrifice, it has to actually be to me. You can't offer someone else's sacrifices to me. And he even points out, do not offer an animal sacrifice to the goat demons at the tabernacle. Now, what's interesting, of all the ones he could have picked, this is the one he picks. But it makes a lot of sense when we consider those 2 times prohibitions about not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk. Because this is how widespread it was, that he has to say this. Don't offer pagan idols, or sacrifice to pagan idols at the tabernacle. Anyone who violated these rules, they were to be cut off. Verses 10 through 14, you're not permitted to eat blood. God's going to say it 3 times in just a couple of verses. But verse 11 gives the reason why. Because the life is in the blood, and the blood will be used to make atonement for our sins. And because of that reason, that's why you have to treat this special. That's why you don't consume it. Because if you just start consuming it and eating it and drinking it, then you're going to treat it like nothing. You're not going to respect the fact that life had to die. It had to end in order for this to be done. And by the time we get to 14, we have 3 times he's told us about this particular admonition. Verse 15 through 16 talks about eating animals that were not killed by human hands. So if you have an animal and a wolf comes in and tears apart one of your sheep, but the meat's still good, can you eat that or not? This is grace for the people, but it will later become a defining line between the priest and the common people, because the priests are not allowed to eat this. But God says, listen, I understand. This is grace. Sometimes you're going to be in a place where the next meal isn't guaranteed. And if this animal dies and you can't do anything with it, just a huge blow it would be to your morale. So as grace, eat it. I'm not going to sacrifice you guys for the sake of the rule, but you're going to honor me still. And so I want you, after you eat the meal and your bellies are full, get cleaned up. You're unclean until evening, because then you remember that still life was taken. Chapter 18, we have rules regarding sexual relations. It starts off with this command to be holy and set apart. The rules regarding sexual contact is not just for the sake of being approved. It makes a point. It says a statement. You're being set apart. Your lives are going to be different. And he begins this moment by declaring that Israel was not to be like the people they left, so the Egyptians, nor like the people they were going to. Because both of those areas would be dominated by their sexual desires. He goes, you're going to be different. Why? Because the Lord your God. God will declare his lordship over Israel 7 times in this passage. Now, we're going to see it like 15 times in the next one. Chapter 19 is the I am the Lord chapter. But he gets started here. He lets us know about his lordship. And what he's going to do in this passage is he ties his lordship to his command. Verse 5 gives us the command and consequence. It's a blessing and a curse. You will live if you do them. The implication is you will not live if you don't. So here's the way it is. Verses 16 through 17, we have prohibition against sex with close blood relatives. And he starts off, verse 6, saying, I am the Lord. And then he says you can't have sex with your father, your mother, father's wife, sister, grandchildren, stepchildren, aunts, uncles, in-laws, and multiple members of the exact same family. And then the repeated idea that he has is you shall not defile a person's nakedness. And the image that we have throughout it is that marriage is to be treated as holy. You will not defile this sacred trust by any relationships, whether you're related to them by blood or not. And that's what we have in one of the passages. He goes, it doesn't matter if you're not blood relatives, you are still going to do this. Marriage was to be treated as holy. It was to be set apart and special, and to share it with anyone else was to treat it profanely. In verses 18 through 20, we have additional prohibitions. In verse 21, he goes into this. He's talking about sexual relationships, and then all of a sudden in verse 21, he says, do not offer your children to Moloch. Now, the reason this is mentioned here is because the two are closely related. They are both sins that come out of the selfish pursuit of personal desire. It's my gratification now. But worse yet is that the children that come out of wanton sex were often treated as unwanted children. And during that time, what they would do then, with all these extra kids that they didn't really need around, they would go and they would offer it to the god Molech. And they do it in a ceremony in which the children were burned alive either by just rolling them into a fire, or they would have these specially made metal ovens or fixtures. And either it was an image of the god with their arms outstretched, or ones that have holes in them like a big giant oven, and they would take the live baby and put it inside of this superheated metal oven, and they would play drums real loud, and they would scream real loud to drown out the sound of the children screaming. And the idea is, if I'm going to give this child up to this god, you're going to give me, the adult, the blessing. And there is nothing new under the sun. Because the same desire for my blessings today for somebody else's sacrifice is alive and well. Verses 22 through 23, God hits us right where we are. This is a tough one, but it's the reality. He ties two thoughts together. In verse 22, you will not lie with a person of the same sex. It's an abomination. Verse 23, you will not have sex with an animal. It's a perversion. And in two verses, God ties these two ideas together. Now, that's a hard sell in our current day. But here's the reality of both. Romans 1, you have left the natural use that I gave you. I set this up. I set this up to be this way. I protect it fiercely. And if you go and you break it for any possible reason, it's an abomination. You have perverted what I established for you. Verses 24 through 30 are commands not to defile themselves. Verse 24 says, these things, if you do these things that I just told you about, you're going to defile the land. And it's a brilliant concept. It's one we're going to see through here all the way through Numbers, especially with the rebellion of Korah, when we see the land actually open up and swallow the people that are in that rebellion. The land is given this almost animated kind of character with it. But the idea is that the land is going to judge you. The land is going to see everything that you're doing. And as you're violating these laws, eventually the land is going to expel you from it. All right, we have the same dynamic going on in Genesis when we see Jacob running from Laban, and Laban catches up to him, and they have this big argument out there in the middle of the desert. So what they do is they make this pile of stones, and they call this pile of stones a heap of witnesses, right? The heap is a witness against you and me. And so they make this covenant, and they go, you know what, even when I can't see you, these stones are going to see what it is that you're doing, and the stones are going to judge you. Now, we know that the stones are not alive, but the idea is valid. Wherever you are, the land is there. The land acts as a witness against you. It goes all the way back to Cain and Abel, and even further than that, to the garden. And Cain and Abel, it's a vivid one. Your brother's blood's crying out from the ground. The earth itself that opened up to receive your brother's blood judges you. And he says, if you do these things, and if you defile the land is going to groan. You're going to be expelled for doing these things. And even though, verse 28, you are God's chosen people, the land will spew you out, just like it's going to eject these people out. Verse 30, the final charge, you are to keep my command. Why? I am the Lord your God. Chapter 19. This is the I am the Lord chapter. It's arguably the most important chapter in the book of Leviticus, if not the Old Testament. And the reason why is because God is going to give us repeated character ideas from him. These are the things that are important to my heart, and then he's going to constantly undergird it with the idea, I am the Lord. You do this, or you don't do this. Why? I am the Lord. And by repeating it 15 times, he weaves these commands with his authority. You can't separate one from the other. And in verse 1 and 2, he sets the expectation. You shall be holy as I am holy. In verse 3, he gets to the first one. You're going to revere your parents. And he combines the idea of respecting and reverencing your parents with keeping the Sabbath. Because the idea behind both is that you show awe and respect for those who did for you what you could not do for yourself. That's the idea behind the Sabbath. That's the idea behind the resting. Remember that Jesus paid it all, that we don't save ourselves by our own hands. Same thing for Israel. You didn't save yourself from Egypt by your own hands. The same idea behind honoring your mother and your father doesn't mean you do everything that they say. It means that they always matter, that their words always have weight. And you're going to show respect for them because they did for you what you could not do for yourself. Verse 4, no idols. It comes after the command to honor your parents. But no idols. Verses 5 through 8, offer your fellowship in such a way that you want it to be accepted. Don't offer it in an apathetic manner. Do it in such a way that you want God to receive it with pleasure. And explains so much when we see this one, when we look at Cain and why his sacrifice was refused. Not because he did it the wrong way, because he had the wrong heart. Verses 9 through 18 are laws regarding our heart towards other. And again, it's interwoven with this idea of I am the Lord. But verses 9 through 10, consider the poor and do not glean your field in such a way that leaves nothing for them. Now, the idea is beautiful. We'll see this throughout the law, especially in this chapter. Many times we'll have it, but we'll also see it in another place when we get to one of the feasts. Israel's told that when you go into the land and you have your field, they're going to be big, giant rectangles or whatnot, or whatever the shape of the land may be. But you're going to reap it and glean from it in such a way that you leave the corners intact. You're just going to leave them out there. The reason you're going to do that is so that the poor in the land can come through. And as long as they aren't carrying a basket or a wheelbarrow, you're going to let them get whatever they can grab with their hands so they can always feed themselves. Because you didn't do this on your own. I did this for you. And even when you go through and you gather it, and you gather the sheaves together, there's going to be so much that some of it's going to fall down. Your arms aren't going to be big enough to hold it. Don't go back for a second pass. Leave it. Because the reason it fell out of your hands is because you're going to have so much, you can't hold it all in one go. Again, I gave that to you. You're going to leave that for them. Consider them. Leave something for them. Verses 11 through 12, be honest in your dealings. But verse 12 says, do not swear by God something that you know to be false. Verse 13 and 14, do not oppress those in a vulnerable position. So he comes back to that same idea. And it's that idea of just because you can doesn't mean you should. Verse 15, do not manipulate justice. And he goes, don't be partial to the poor or the rich. Don't value this one because they're in a rough spot. Don't value this one because they can do more for you. Just judge fairly. Just be honest in your dealings. Verses 16 through 18, do not falsely tear down the reputation of another. Don't hate another Israelite. You may hate their sin, but do not incur sin because you hate them. Verse 19 is really weird, right? Starts talking about don't mix different kinds of cattle, different kinds of seed, different kinds of garment. And we're like, what does this have to do with anything? But the idea is brilliant. Because what he's teaching them by the law is something that he mentioned to Aaron all the way back in chapter 10 when Nadab and Abihu died. And the reason that Aaron wasn't able to mourn is he's going to show Israel by his example the difference between what is holy and what is profane. The thing that comes naturally, but you have to say no to, and the thing that only I can make happen in you. And what he's doing in this passage is he says, you're not going to weave together two things that don't go together. You're not going to mix two kinds of cattle. You're not going to mix two kinds of seed. You're not going to mix two kinds of garments. They just won't go together. One will tear at the other. You don't mix what is holy with the profane. We have to be a people who keep the light separate from the dark. Do not compromise the truth with what is false. Verse 20 through 22 discusses responsibility for a woman who's taken advantage of. This is not rape. Rape is always a death penalty offense. That's Deuteronomy chapter 22. This is a woman who is engaged to someone else, and then another man sleeps with her. But it's not adultery. He doesn't put it in that category here. Because in this idea is this woman who's been taken advantage of. She's been talked into it. So her ability to choose is still there, but it's kind of impaired. So he permits grace in this. But there is responsibility now. The man doesn't get to come and have his way and indulge himself and then just leave her alone because now she has no options in the culture at the time. But it is still sin. So what the man does is the man bears the cost for the guilt offering because sin has still happened. The man bears it, though. He brings a ram before the Lord. Since it's a guilt offering, he pays the cost plus an additional fifth to the one to whom she was intended, which tells us that she was engaged. And it appears likely that laws from Exodus chapter 22 would then apply there to make sure that she is taken care of, whether they are married or not. Verses 23 through 25, we have another weird one here. Now we have laws about the trees in the promised land. We start off with honoring your mother and your father. We come down here about sexual relations again, and then he goes, oh, by the way, the trees. When you go into the land, you need to plant a brand new tree. Now, these are not established trees. These are brand new trees. When you get brand new trees there, you're not allowed to take any of their fruit for the first year. And you're not going to take any for their second or third year. But this is actually an incredibly brilliant idea that he's giving to them. Because in those first couple of years, the tree is not going to be strong enough to produce much fruit. And the way the tree is designed is for that fruit to fall and some of that fruit to just decompose right there at the base of the tree. It will actually feed the soil around the tree and help the tree to get bigger. If you let the fruit fall, by your deferred enjoyment today, you come out with a better bounty later. But you have to say no to things today. You have to deny just a little bit today so that your tomorrow will be better. And by deferring enjoyment, you're going to help the tree. You're going to help the surrounding ecology. The tree will grow stronger during this time. And then in the fourth year, so 1, 2, and 3, don't eat the fruit. And the fourth year is the first time that you can take the fruit for yourself. It's going to be a strong tree now, good fruit. You don't get that one either, because that one's mine. He says you're going to take all the fruit from that tree and you're going to offer it as the first fruits offering for that tree. But then in the fifth year, and as long as you're in the land, you and your family will get to eat from that tree. And because you took the time in those first few years to trust me, and in the fourth year to trust me, the fifth year and on, you're going to have a better tree than if you just indulged yourself in the very first year. It's a brilliant, brilliant idea he gives them. Verses 26 through 28, we have prohibition against cultic practices and this trimming of the beards and cutting one's body and memorial tattoos. They're ideas of, they're Canaanite practices of honoring the dead or appeasing the dead. Right? We're no longer under the law, but that idea of having that memorial tattoo on your body is covered in this. But the idea is, why are you doing it? Are you doing it to appease the dead? Are you doing it for another reason? So verse 29, do not sell your daughter into a pagan temple to make her a temple prostitute. Again, he protects her underneath this command, I am the Lord. Verse 30, keep the Sabbath. Verse 31, do not seek out people who will direct you to false gods. So don't look for bad influences. If you know they're bad influences, stay away. Verse 32, he returns back to the heart of verse 3. Honor the aged, honor those elders who are before you, and if you honor them, you will honor God. Verse 33 through 34, again, we have repeats. Be kind to the stranger. He's really reinforcing this with us. Verse 35 through 36, be honest in your dealings. False weights are an abomination to the Lord. Verse 37, the confirming command, thus you shall observe all that I have commanded you. Why? For I am the Lord. Chapter 20, God starts talking about punishments for violations of the laws that he's talked about before. But note that God explains the repercussions for failing to abide by the aforementioned laws. He's telling them the consequences before they even get into the land, before they even leave Mount Sinai. They're still at Mount Sinai by the time they're getting these particular laws. But he starts off with punishment for those who sacrifice their children. He goes, if someone sacrifices their child to Moloch, the people of the land are to stone this one with stones. Now, the people of the land refers to the nation. All of us. We're all going to be a part of this. And it's a national response because it has to be a national rejection of the sin. But here's the thing that we need to understand. If the nation refuses to do this, if they refuse to stone this one person, then what God will do, he will cut off both the man and his entire family from Israel. Why? Because now you're making God come in and remove all aspects of the influence out. If as a nation, you don't go, we do not do this here. You who did this will bear the penalty for it. If you go, you know what, we're just going to turn a blind eye to it, then you are asking God to come through. And he's going to make it so that everyone has to notice what it is that was done. Verse 7 through 8, the reason why these punishments are so stern is because we are to be holy. For Israel's God is the God who sanctifies them. And he'll say this a couple of times. I'm the one who makes you clean. I didn't save you to leave you in the mud. I saved you to get you out of the mud. So stop going into the mud. We're told if anyone curses their parents, they're to be put to death. Verses 10 through 21, punishment for the violations of the sexual laws. And most of these are death penalty offenses here. Verses 23 to 26, we have a command to be holy. Do not follow the customs of the people who are being driven out. You're to be different. And by being different, you will make a distinction between the clean and the unclean. Verse 26, therefore, be holy as the Lord is holy. And then out of nowhere, he gives us 27. It's the first indication of something like this. He says, anyone who's a medium, who seeks after spirits, you're to put him to death. Now, it seems to come out of nowhere. We were just talking about the sexual laws. So what's going on with this? It's actually kind of a brilliant one. It acts as a bridge between what came before it and what came after it. It's at the end of this command to be holy. And in the next chapter, he goes to instructions about the priest being holy. God understands us. He understands that within us is this desire for something greater than us, whether we admit it or not. And he goes, anybody who comes into your nation and seeks to find that something greater in anything other than the Lord, you have to withstand them. They have to be put to death. They have to be removed completely. All of their influence ended, and it has to be done in such a way that the people understand what it is that I am not about. Chapter 21, the priests are to be holy. The priests cannot defile themselves for a dead body. There's some exceptions here. They're not to practice pagan rituals. But verse 6 gives us the reason why they have to be holy. Because they're the ones who offer the offerings to the Lord. Now, this is going to be a huge issue for this particular chapter. Because they're the ones who offer the offerings on behalf of Israel. In order for those offerings to be accepted, the hands that offer them have to be clean. Again, we look at Aaron. There really isn't a more high-profile person inside of Israel during their time in the wilderness that had more mistakes than Aaron. It's why he's such a weak picture of the high priest that is to come. But there is this incredible pressure upon them. There's responsibility. Because you offer these things to the Lord, you must be holy. You are approaching a holy God. And then he goes, verse 7, you have to be holy in your relationships as well. So not just what you do with your person, but the very marriage that you're in must be holy. And God repeats in verse 8 the reason of verse 6, because they're offering the offerings to God. Verse 10 through 15 talks about the holiness of the high priest. Verse 16 through 24 says, anyone who has a disability cannot serve as a priest. That seems unbelievably harsh. But the idea is not to tear down or to exclude. Look at verse 22. It's one of those, if you write in your Bible, that you want to put an arrow next to or something like that. Verse 22 tells us that the person with the disability who cannot serve as a priest is still provided for. It doesn't mean that you're not good enough to serve, so you got to get out. That's not what he's saying. You still provide for them. They still have a living. They're still part of the family. They just can't serve as priest. And that's because the priest and the tabernacle were to be a message for the people that only the perfect worshiper can be allowed to draw close. Which means none of us can draw close, which is why we have to have Jesus. Why only Jesus can do what it is that he does, because he alone is perfect. He alone can make the way for us. Chapter 22 talks about the presentation of holy gifts. It's really interesting because it's hard to figure out from the context here what holy gifts are, but when we get to Numbers chapter 5, it tells us that holy gifts are the portion that are reserved for the priest. So it's the gift that God gives from the sacrifices to those that he says, these are mine. Remember, he takes the Levites to himself in place of the firstborn. We'll see that again in Numbers, but we touched on it in the book of Exodus. But when the worshipers come and they bring their sacrifice, there's a portion that is always going to be given to the priest that is doing this, unless we have certain exceptions. We've talked about those in the past. But that breast and that thigh will go to the priest that offers the sacrifice on behalf of the worshiper. And God goes, this is my gift to you. You stand in this place. I ask all these things of you. I am asking you to be holy the way that I am holy. Think about the pressure that puts on you every time you go to do this thing, and you're thinking about all the things you messed up and you haven't confessed yet. He goes, I know I'm putting pressure on you. I'm asking a lot of you, but I give you so much more in return. And every time you do this service for me, I actively bless you with more than you can possibly eat in a single meal. It's going to be enough to not just bless you, but your entire family. But you're going to treat that gift as holy as well. These holy gifts, he says, be careful how you handle these. And then he immediately addresses the personal cleanliness of the priest, because the two are tied together. How you handle it has nothing to do with the ritual. It has everything to do with the purity of your heart, the cleanliness of your hands. He doesn't talk about the holy gift actually at all. Like I said, we got to go to Numbers 5 to figure out what the holy gift is. God is concerned with how the priests protect their personal righteousness. He starts off practically, verse 3 through 7, the priest must be physically clean, so you can't be nasty and dirty and do the work of ministry. Where we talked about before that the regular folk, as it were, could eat an animal that was killed not by human hands. The priest could not. Even the things that they put into their bodies have to be clean. Verse 9, do not profane the holy gifts I give you. This warning is repeated in verses 9, 15, and 16. If you fail to keep the Lord's charge, you will bear your sin because you have profaned the charge of the Lord. Verses 11 through 13, people who are not priests but are part of the priest's family are allowed to partake of the holy gifts because of God's grace. And then he has this moment. He says, if a priest purchases a slave with his own money, the slave comes under the umbrella of grace given to the high priest. Now, we're going to see this throughout the law. And you're like, well, why didn't God just get rid of all the slaves? Because God was going to work in Israel. And he knows that slavery is going to exist outside of it. The mechanism, both what we think of in our Western mind, but also the economic loophole that it was in the Middle East at the time. He goes, but this is what you're going to do. You're going to take slaves from the outside, and you're going to treat them like family on the inside. you're going to give them a life and access to something they could never have had on their own. And by this way, you're going to show my grace to you. Why? Because you were once slaves too. We're told that if a priest's daughter marries someone who's not a priest, she can no longer eat of the holy gifts. But if she's widowed or divorced and comes back home, and that's a big, big deal, that's grace. Because she left the father's home. But if for some reason she has to come home, then don't worry, darling. You get to be a part of this. You get to enjoy these holy gifts as well. And that's a huge part of their sustenance through this time. Verse 16 really touches me. Because it says, you're going to do these things, and if you don't, you're going to bear the punishment. Why? Because I'm the Lord who does what? Sanctifies them. I'm the one who makes you clean. And for me, when I look at it, and especially what it is that God has called me to do, it has that Matthew chapter 8, verses 2 through 3 dynamic, when the leper comes to Jesus, and he's just crying out to him, and he says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And he goes, I am willing. Be clean. And he touches him. It's the same dynamic that we see here. You're going to do these things, not because I'm putting on you burdens that you can't stand, because I'm the one who cleaned you in the first place. Verses 17 through 28, we have requirements for animal sacrifices. Then he starts talking about peace offering details. We have a confirmation of the command at the end of the chapter. Israel was to keep the commandments because the Lord is the one who sanctifies you. I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt, and I am the Lord. Again, chapter 23. Now we start to get into the feast calendar for the year. And he says these are going to be feasts, are going to be holy days, and some Bible translations you might hear them called high days, H-I-G-H days, or high holy days even. He says these are holy convocations. Now that's a really churchy word. It means for a gathering. When this is a holy convocation, you're going to get all the people together. This isn't something you celebrate in your home to the exclusion of everybody else. This is when the entire nation gets together and celebrates or remember a particular thing. And that idea of a holy convocation is really important, especially when we get to the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks. And we think about the people that Peter is talking to then. But he says these are times appointed by God. Therefore, failure to gather is to go against the heart of God. But then everything begins with verse 3 with the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the small unit template for all the feasts that come after it. It's that remembrance. Our rest is in the finished work of the Lord. And the lesson of the weekly Sabbath is the foundation for everything else that follows. But then he starts to go. At the beginning of your year, it's going to happen in this month, kind of our late March to early April, as it were. It starts with Passover, verses 4 through 5. This is the remembrance of what the Lord did to bring you out of Egypt. So it's that, everything starts with that. What's our year start with? Remembering that we didn't save ourselves, that God's the one who saved us. But then it's immediately followed, verses 6 through 8, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the celebration of the new life that we have in God, leaving the old, entering the new. But here's the brilliance of it. Passover happens on this day, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins the next day. One's 1 day, one's 7 days, but they kind of treated it like a big 8-day feast. But it was technically multiple feasts. We actually have a third feast snuck in here as well. But they would celebrate over the course of 8 continuous days. In verse 6, he says, during these days, not so much Passover, but they would have unleavened bread with the Passover meal. He goes, you're not to eat any leaven. Leaven was the image of sin. Leaven is that decomposition that corrupts the rest of the material that it's in. He says, you're not going to have any of that because it celebrates this new life and a complete rejection of sin. It starts with the holy convocation, so again, a gathering of the people. And the first day is treated as a Sabbath. And if you're trying to figure out how Jesus could be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, why didn't they just go the next day? The women were obviously desperate to go and take care of his body. This explains why. Because Passover is treated like a Sabbath. There's a regular Saturday in there too. And the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is treated as a Sabbath. So then they have to wait for those 3 days to get passed, and then the first day they can go out there and do it and not be in violation of the law is when they go and find the empty tomb. Verses 9 through 14, we have the Feast of First Fruits. It's a celebration of praise of what God has provided and what he's going to provide. And what this feast is a step of faith, right? It was to occur at the time of the barley harvest. So again, is that late March, early April time period. Because verse 11 mentions that this was to happen after the Sabbath, so we assume it's that first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The tradition was to celebrate it right after that first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. which just so happens to coincide with the resurrection of Jesus when the ladies go to the tomb and they find that it's empty. So he dies just before Passover. He's in the grave on Passover. He's in the grave on the first day of a Feast of Unleavened Bread. He's in the grave for that Saturday, which is a Sabbath as well. And their first opportunity to go and do anything, when the priest would be getting ready to do the offering for the Feast of First Fruits, they go there and they find that he's already risen. Why? Because he's the firstborn among his brethren. But what this feast celebrates is this new harvest that's coming. And they're not even allowed to eat of the new harvest. They're still eating the old grain during this time until this ceremony happens. And it is a step of faith, because what you do is when the barley starts going up, you go out into the field and you get the best-looking sheaf of barley that you can, and you would cut that down. And then you would take it to the temple, and they would offer it. And then after it is offered as a grain offering, then you could go out to the field and start cutting stuff down. But what you're doing is you're taking the best part first, and you're going, I'm trusting God to give us something else. Because if not, then I just gave a big chunk of my feast over to the Lord. But you're trusting that he's going to come through. After this is the Feast of Weeks, or what we call Pentecost. Pentecost referring to 50 days. But the way that they would observe this one is from the Feast of First Fruits. They would count 7, 7. So 7 days times 7, that's 49 days. And the day after it is the 50th day, that's Pentecost. They would have the Feast of Weeks. What this is a celebration of the full barley harvest coming in. So over the course of 7 weeks, they're working to get all of the barley in. It's all popped up. They've cut it down. They got it in. The wheat harvest is just about to begin. So it's really going to get cooking at that point. They had a wave offering. There were burnt offerings, sin offerings, peace offerings. It was a really large ordeal. But the people were to come and to gather. It's a holy convocation. And there's going to be this proclamation to the people declaring the faithfulness of the Lord. This is when Peter steps forward and he addresses the pilgrims who are in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. It's a one-day feast. And this is when he tells them about what it is that Jesus has done. And this is when the church begins to explode. Verse 22 tells us, we have this reminder, don't reap the corners of the field, leave them for the needy, don't pick up the gleanings. If it falls out of your arm, just leave it there. You don't need it. The reason you couldn't hold it all is because you can't hold it all. So you don't need it. Take the rest home. Leave that for the poor. Do it. Why? Because I am the Lord your God. It's mentioned here because this feast deals with the harvest. But also we're to remember as Christians that the gospel is for the poor and the downtrodden, which means it's for all of us. After this, we're getting to that 7th month. Now we have verses 23 through 32, the Feast of Trumpets. It's a really interesting one because it's almost kind of hard to figure out what it's talking about. We're told that it's a celebration, right? It's a feast, but we're told that it's a reminder. And we go, a reminder of what? Reminder of what he did in the past? Well, kind of, sort of, until you look at what the silver trumpets are doing in the book of Numbers. And it's always to call action and attention and the focus and attention of the people inside of Israel. It seems most likely what it is a reminder of is the Day of Atonement that's going to happen in 10 days. So in the beginning of this 7th month, we have this Feast of Trumpets. They were to blow trumpets. And what we can tell from tradition, it appears that they started blowing it first thing in the morning, and they blew it all day long until evening. It was a reminder of what's coming. Verse 25 tells us that there's offerings by fire, but it doesn't tell us what they are. If you want to write in your margin here, Numbers 29 actually lists them. Numbers 29 lists the burnt offerings, bulls and rams and 7 male lambs, 1 year old without defect. We have grain offerings for each of these. We have a sin offering, a burnt offering for the new moon because it's the beginning of a month, and then the continual daily burnt offering with its grain offering, its drink offering. So that's in Numbers chapter 29. But it's interesting. He doesn't mention it here because he doesn't want us to lose focus on what it is that he's talking about. Verses 26 through 32, we're told that's the Day of Atonement. So again, the trumpets go on the first day. 10 days later, you're going to have the Day of Atonement. A solemn day to remember that God removes our sins in order to restore our fellowship with him. The atonement, at one-ment with God. It's to happen, and he says, exactly the 10th day of the 7th month. So this is 9 days after the Feast of Trumpets, right? On exactly has a hard and unyielding feel to it. It has to be done specifically on a certain day. And it tells us if it doesn't happen this day, it does not happen at all. The offerings for this one are listed as well in Numbers chapter 29, if you want to scribble that in the margin. But verse 28, they're to do no work on this day. It's a day where God does all of the work. They receive all of the benefit. Verses 33 through 43, we have the last of the feast. Depending on your translation, it might call it the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Ingathering. I just kind of call it the Feast of Tabernacles. But it's the celebration that God is with us, that he has been with us through this entire time. This one is still in the 7th month. So first day, Feast of Trumpets. 10th day, Day of Atonement. The 15th day of the 7th month is the Feast of Booths. So this is 5 days after the Day of Atonement. This logically comes after the Day of Atonement because on that Day of Atonement, God forgives us sin and makes us at one with him. And then 5 days later, we celebrate that God is with us. This feast and the Day of Atonement are the only ones in this chapter where God goes out of his way to tell us the meaning of it. The rest of them we kind of have to research in other areas, but these two, he goes, I want you to understand this. This matters to me. And he tells us the meaning of it. Verse 43, Israel lived in booths. They lived in makeshift tents, if you were, when I brought them out of Egypt. They didn't have homes like you have homes now. So for 7 days, you're going to live like they did. It's going to be like camping outside. You're going to live in booths in remembrance of how God was with them in the wilderness. When they didn't even have solid walls, I was with them then. I sustained them when they had nothing and brought them out of Egypt. And for 7 days, you're going to remember this. And on the 8th day, you'll get to go back in your house, but it's still part of the same feast. It's the Sabbath day. It's the Sabbath rest. Now, this feast is technically 8 days, right? 7 days out in the booth and 1 day back in the house. So it is officially the single longest of the feast. Since the 8 days of Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread are technically 2 feasts. But it makes perfect sense that the longest feast that he gives to Israel the entire year is the one that celebrates that God is with us. It celebrates our fellowship with him. Now, again, Numbers 29 lists the feast here. It's a huge list of feasts. There's specific offerings every single day for the 8 days. It starts with 13 bulls, and then all these different burnt offerings, grain offerings, a sin offering, daily burnt offering, and then it goes down by one until on the 8th day you have a particular one at 7, and then it kind of bottoms out. It's just brilliant what it is that God does. Chapter 24. God gets back to practical matters after the feast. He says, you know what, for the lampstands, make sure they're burning all the time. The idea of the lampstand was that illumination of the glory of God, what it is that he is shining upon us. But remember, when you go into the tabernacle, that lampstand would be on one side and was to be shining towards the table of showbread. So as you come in, you see that light. What's the thing it's directing your attention to? The furnishing that celebrates that God is with us, that we have fellowship with him. He says it's to be kept burning all the time. Why? Because I never want you to forget that my heart is to have fellowship with you. We have instructions for the laying out of bread on the table of showbread, verses 10 through 16. We suddenly go from instruction and lecture to narrative. We have this incident that happens when a man who has a Jewish mother and an Egyptian father, so he's part of the mixed multitude references that we have in the Pentateuch. But he curses the name of God. Now, the reason he mentions that he's got a Jewish mother and he's got an Egyptian father is a couple of reasons. One is that they believe that your Jewishness, your ethnic grouping came through your mother. It didn't come through your father, it came through your mother. So if you had a Jewish mother, that would make you Jewish. So he's bound under the law. But the other idea of this, of having parents of 2 different cultures, is that you're not sold out to either one of them. That you have this compromise, this idea of mixed values or compromised values. He gets into a struggle with another Jewish person. He curses the name of God. And when the people hear it, they immediately grab him, but they don't know what to do. I mean, they know they're not supposed to take the name of the Lord in vain, but this is new for us. We're figuring this out. So they take him to Moses, and Moses goes to God, and God says, I want you to do this. You are to take this person who cursed the name of the Lord your God outside of the camp. Let those who heard him curse be the ones to lay their hands on his head. So they're saying, we heard this, and we are standing by the punishment that is about to happen. If something happens to him and we're lying about it, we're bearing the guilt on ourselves. And then all the congregation would stone him, for whoever curses his God will bear his own sin. When we go through the scriptures, when you see this idea of stoning associated with judgment for blasphemy, for breaking the character of God. As far as we can tell from history, the Israelites only had 2 methods of execution, at least the ancient ones did. One was stoning, the other was strangulation. Those were the 2 that they did. You couldn't hang somebody up on a tree. They would strangle you down on the ground. But the idea of the stone is, again, that idea we talked about before about the earth itself judging. Okay? So I can't put my hands on you because I'm not allowed to. God said, going back to Noah in Genesis, whoever takes your life, I'm going to bear an accounting for them. So this is the earth itself being used in judgment against the person. It's not going to be my hand itself that's touching you. And we'll see this throughout, especially when we get to books like Ezekiel and we see, or Joshua as well, as God sends hailstones down. It is that punishment for blasphemy. This may all seem very harsh, He said a curse word, what's the big deal? But we need to remember, this is a time when they could actively see the presence of God in their midst. They didn't have to wonder if he was there. They could look out their tent flap and see him right there. They could see his presence. And if they're willing to dismiss him as nothing when he's right there, what would they do when they can't see him? Verse 17 through 22, he talks about eye for an eye again, but he does it in this particular manner. He says there's going to be one standard for everyone who's in Israel. Doesn't matter if his mom's Jewish or if his mom's not Jewish. Doesn't matter. If they are in this nation, there's going to be one rule, one standard for everyone. And this demand for fairness is undergirded with God, reminding them that what? I am the Lord. Chapter 25, he talks about rest and redemption. It's a beautiful section. It's a wonderful way to start drawing this book to a close. He talks about the Sabbath year. Now, just like the Sabbath day, you work for 6 days and then you rest on the seventh. On the Sabbath year, you're going to work for 6 years. But on the seventh year, you're not going to actively work the land. You're going to take a break. The entire year, and whatever naturally grows in the field, that's what you're going to eat. What the land produced was for every person, so not just you, but the poor, the animals, anyone who wants to graze in it, they can come and get food. Now, it's a beautiful idea, but then he doubles down on it. He goes, and by the way, every 50th year, so after 7 sevens, so that's 49 years, on the 50th year, on the Day of Atonement, so the 10th day of the 7th month, you're going to blow a ram's horn. And it's going to indicate that this is the year of Jubilee. This declared that everyone would get to return back to their property, even if they had to sell their land due to hardship, even though there are some exceptions where you don't get your land back. But like the Sabbath year, you're not to work the field. So every 50th year, that's going to be 2 back-to-back years where you don't have to work. You get an all-year-long vacation, and God is going to provide for you. But we're going to start to wonder, well, how are you going to provide for us? What am I going to eat over those 2 years? Hold that question. We'll get to it in verses 20 through 22. But again, they're not to work in the fields, but we're told if the land is sold, you're going to sell land based on how many potential their harvests there are to the next Jubilee. Because what they understand now is if I sell land, I don't get it forever. So I'm not going to pay full price for that. So what you would do is you would count up how many harvests are there between now and then. What's my economic value I can get out of the land? Because the land is for working, except for the Sabbath year, except for the Jubilee year. And the price was always based on however many harvests there were until that. So that way nobody was getting swindled, because at the end of it, I'm getting my land back. So there's no reason for you paying for what you're not going to eventually get to use. They were to do this because they feared the Lord. They were to observe these while they dwelt in the land. And there was a reassurance that you will eat in the back-to-back Sabbath and Jubilee years. And then he tells them how in verses 20 through 22. He says, you know what? I'm going to give you so much in the 6th year. You're going to have enough to eat all year long in the 7th year. And if there's a Jubilee year, I'm going to give you enough in the 6th year that you'll be able to eat in the 7th year and the 8th year, and enough to eat in the 9th year until the harvest comes in. He even thinks about that gap between the end of the year and the next harvest coming in, because they don't run right next to each other, because he thinks everything. So essentially in the 6th year, he's going to give them enough for 2.5 years. Verses 23 through 28, we have some of the rules about treatment of property because of Jubilee. Then we have some exceptions, verses 29 through 31. If you sell land and it's a dwelling inside of a walled city because it doesn't have access to fields, you're not going to get that back in the same way. Exception number 2, property of the Levites. Levites can always redeem their land anytime they want to, but if they don't, it goes back to them in the year of Jubilee because they don't have an inheritance. Remember, they're only going to have certain cities, but their Levites are never permitted to sell their pasture land. Because by selling your pasture land, you place into jeopardy the food for all the people in that Levitical city, because they're depending on your land to help provide for everybody else. So you're not allowed to sell that land ever. You will always have access to food. Verses 35 through 46, we have rules for slavery, but God is especially talking about the Jewish slave, and he's telling you, if a fellow Israelite is destitute, you are going to support them. I'm not going to tell you just go sell people into slavery. You're going to instead treat them like a hired servant, like an employee. And these rules are to be followed. Why? Because I'm the one who rescued you from slavery. Don't forget where you came from. So you're not going to treat them as slaves, because you know what it's like to be treated as slaves. You're going to treat them like hired men. They're going to be employees for you. You're going to pay them a wage. And then they're going to go free from your service in the year of Jubilee. And if you help them get a family while they are under your care, they get to go with their family. Now, we will see occasions. We talked about this when we looked at the bondservant. If a person came in and they weren't Jewish and they became a slave in that year Jubilee when they're going free, then if they had a family that the master gave them, he wasn't allowed to take the family. You didn't bring that in with you. He could decide whether to stay there with the master or to go. But if they're an Israelite, you let them go. And we'll see in another place, you don't just let them go. You give them enough stuff to start brand new. They came to you in slavery. They came to you because they had nothing else. And by the time they leave you, they're going to be so much better off than they were when they came, because this is the heart of God. Why? Because you were slaves when I found you, and you're not now. Still in the same section, you're not permitted to sell the poor into slavery. You're not allowed to take advantage of them. Verse 43, here's a big one. Do not treat him with severity. It doesn't matter what form or fashion they serve under you. You do not treat them with severity. And by not treating them poorly, you will revere your God. Verse 44 through 46, Israel may acquire slaves from the people groups around them. They're not allowed to go and capture slaves. That's not permitted. But they're allowed to acquire slaves. Why? Because we're taking people from bondage out there and we're making them family in here. We're giving them a place to belong and then we're treating them well. Verses 47 through 55, it talks about how to redeem those who have sold themselves into slavery. So this is the idea of the kinsman redeemer. Even if you sold this person to a Gentile and they're like, well, I don't have to follow your rules. Yeah, you do. One rule for the Jew and one rule for the Gentile within Israel's borders. We're allowed to come and buy our brother back from service. The Gentile must treat the Jew in the same way an Israelite would treat their countrymen, without severity. That's verse 43. And even if they can't be redeemed, even if you're a Gentile and you're not technically under our rules, doesn't matter. They get to go free in the year of Jubilee. That's verse 54. They're to be redeemed. Why? Verse 55, this is important. You're to let them go because they belong to the Lord. This is the same thing God kept saying to Pharaoh, right? You need to let my people go. Why? So that they may serve me. Because they're mine. They're my people. And if you do this, if you don't let go of my firstborn son, I'm going to take your firstborn son. So this is the reinforcement of what he's been saying throughout this time. They don't belong to you. Don't get it twisted. I don't care if they sold themselves into slavery to you or not. They belong to me. Chapter 26. Verses 1 through 11 are blessings if Israel is obedient. And it kind of follows this outline. If you do these three things for me, Israel, no idols, honor the Sabbath, follow my commands. Those are the three things he asks. Then I will give you rain in the season. I will grant you peace in the land. I will make you fruitful and you will multiply. And I will confirm my covenant with you. Beautiful and sweet. And then in 14 through 39, he gives the punishment as Israel is disobedient, and he goes the exact opposite in graphic detail. There's portions of this, we're going to look at it and we go, that cannot be possible. And then you go over and you look at the books of the Kings and the book of the Chronicles, and you're like, they're absolutely going to do this. We're going to see things that are just disgusting to us, but it speaks to the desperation that they will later find themselves in because of their sin. But despite all that, verses 40 through 45, he goes, despite all that you will endure, if you will just confess your sin and humble your heart, I will remember my covenant with you. Now, there's still consequences. He tells them, you're still going to be outside of the land. It speaks of the Babylonian captivity before the Babylonian captivity. He goes, there's going to be consequences because I'm going to let my land rest. It goes back to previous things that we already discussed. But I will remember you and I will bring you back. Verse 46, the concluding statement, these are the statutes and ordinances and laws which the Lord has established between himself and the sons of Israel through Moses and Mount Sinai. And it seems like a perfect ending to the chapter. And by the way, there's one more. Now, chapter 27 has the feeling of an add-on, almost kind of like, oh, Moses, I forgot to tell you. But the reason that it's phased here and not in the previous one, remember how the previous one ended, talked about statutes and ordinances and laws. These aren't either of those. These are free will vows that you are taking. These exist outside of law. This is something that you are putting on your heart and saying, you know what, I want to dedicate myself to service. I want to dedicate my land to service, my house to service, my animals to service. But notice what God does. He explains the weight of what you're committing before you do it. He gives you the pros and cons before he teaches you about the vows. Now, verses 5 through 8 talk about the value of a person. It's almost a table inside of the words where he talks about if you want to redeem somebody from a vow that they made, this is how you do it. And one of the big things that you see when you jump down on it and you look at it, boy, the guys are going for a higher price than the girls. So what's going on? The table appears to be based on the amount of output a person could give out in an agricultural setting. It's why a male between ages 20 and 59 go for the highest amount, 50 shekels, because that would be the productive years where they would be able to work. But the thing we need to look at is not that the guys are worth more than the girls to God. That's not the way it works. That's kind of like an immature, selfish thought. What he's saying is that the guys are going to get themselves in deeper. You're going to have to pay more to get them out. Because they have the responsibility upon them, because they have the authority upon them, because I gave Adam the law, not Eve. That's why the first sin is on Adam, it's not on Eve. Well, she's the one who took the first bite. It doesn't matter. Adam's the one who received the law. Sin comes through Adam, and because of that, it will take more to get him out. If the person was very, very poor, then the priest would assign a value to the person, so not to break the bank. But the idea is, according to the table, if an adult male came and they wanted to dedicate themselves to service at the temple, I want to dedicate myself to the will of God. He could do one of two things. He could serve at the temple, so kind of think about, little boy Samuel going to serve at the tabernacle with Eli, or he goes, I want to serve, my heart is just so desperate for God, but I can't be away from my family that long. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take this 50 shekels and allow these 50 shekels to stand in my place, and they're going to accomplish the work that I want to do for the Lord. What this free will vow is an expression of love and dedication to God. If they wanted to bring an animal, this is verses 9 through 13, they could bring one, but it cannot be swapped. Once you say that this is the donkey or the horse or whatever it is that I'm dedicating, you don't get to switch it out. You could dedicate a home. The priest goes to it, determines the value for it, and then you give it to the priest. If you ever want it back, you have to pay that value that the priest determined plus 1/5. Dedicating a field, it's based on how much seed is needed to plant the field until the next Jubilee. So again, that land has that idea of harvest because the land is supposed to go back to the original owner. You can't dedicate it forever. But if you do want to redeem it, you pay the value plus 1/5. But here's this weird caveat in it. If you go and dedicate it, and then you decide, you know what? I kind of need to sell it. You can sell it. You can sell it to somebody else. But at the year of Jubilee, it doesn't come back to you because you dedicated it to the Lord. And now you violated that and you sold it. So now when the year of Jubilee, the person who bought it doesn't get it either. It goes back to the priest. Why? Now it is being dedicated to the purposes of God. You got that initial benefit in the beginning. You got to feel good about it. You made the vow. Then you sold it and you got the money. That money didn't go to the Lord. It went to you. But now you don't get to have the land. It goes to the priest in the year of Jubilee. Verses 22 through 24, dedicating land will return back to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. Verse 25, the shekel to be used is the shekel of the sanctuary. It's the only monetary unit that can be trusted. False scales and weights were an abomination to the Lord, so everything is based on this particular shekel. Verses 26 through 27, if it's a firstborn animal, you can't dedicate it. Why? Because they belong to God already. You can't give him what is already his. Verses 28 through 29 gets really interesting because it talks about devoted things. And we're not really sure what it means by devoted things. It talks about things that have an irrevocable dedication. Things set aside for these particular devoted things cannot be redeemed ever. So it seems to be things like the city of Jericho when Israel goes into the promised land. This first one's mine. You don't get to have it. You have to put everything in it to the sword and break it down. Or think about the command to Saul to kill all of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. God said, these are dedicated to me. You don't get to excuse these for any reason, which is why Saul will get into so much trouble when he spares the king and some of the animals. Verses 30 through 33 talks about a tithe. This doesn't appear to be a voluntary tithe, but the expected tithe of the yield of what comes out of the land or the animal. If you wanted to redeem the yield of the land, you could, but it was the amount of the tithe plus 1/5. It's kind of a weird one to me. I don't know why you would ever do it. You're not permitted to redeem the tithe of the animals coming out of it. If you're saying, you know what, we're taking this portion, we're going to give it to the Lord. If you try to swap it with another one, you're like, ooh, I kind of want that sheep. Let me give you another one. God goes, that's fine, but now I get both. So it's kind of a weird caveat, but this is part of it. So don't go into those vows without having understood the consequences of what you're doing, which will make sense when we look at some of the other rules. When a lady makes a vow, her father or her husband are allowed to override that because of this, because the vows have so much weight. You're not allowed to make it lightly. It provides a layer of protection over her that the guy does not have. Whatever he says, he is held accountable to it. But then verse 34, this is the concluding statement. This is the end of the commandments. The previous chapter, these are the ends of the laws. But this one, these are the ends of the commandments. I know we went through a lot. That is an incredible, large amount of information. The book of Leviticus is just packed full of so much instruction. But here's the thing to remember about all of this. 3 down, 63 to go. You now have everything you need to teach the first 3 books of the Bible. So who are you teaching? Who are you sharing the words of God to? Father, we love you. Lord, I praise you for the Bible students both today and yesterday, those who are just exhausted. The pace is blistering, Lord. Father, give us wisdom to understand what it is that you want done, to walk according to your ways and to your words. But Lord, these words are so profound. It's not the face of my Jesus on every single page, showing me what he freed me from, reminding me that I couldn't do it on my own, that he found me in bondage, and yet he saved me anyway, that my hands will never be clean enough, I'll never be good enough, that if you put the responsibility upon me, Lord, I will drop it before I leave this place. But my Jesus did it all. He did it all for me so that I can just be with you and celebrate on the longest feast of the year that my God is Emmanuel. He is forever with us. Lord, we love you. We stand in awe of you, and we thank you for your precious word. We are unworthy of you, and yet you call us anyway. Thank you for the sweetness by which you do. Lord, we love you so much. Please be with us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Family, we'll have one last